Hello and welcome. I am Johnny Diamond and this is World Questions, the G7 Summit. The gathering of world leaders is happening here in the UK. I'm in London and I'm video linked to an international panel drawn from each of the G7 countries. The G7, or Group of Seven, consists of the 7 most advanced economies. They are responsible for more than half of global net wealth, and they are all democracies. This weekend, their leaders will be debating some of the most pressing issues facing the world and attempting to lead. To mark the occasion, we've gathered together our own parallel meeting with leading figures and experts drawn from each of the G7 countries. They'll be facing questions from around the globe: climate change, rebuilding after the pandemic, even the threat to democracy itself. There are huge issues for them to tackle. Here's our own G7 panel. From Japan, Senator Rui Matsukawa, Parliamentary Minister for Defence. From Canada, Bob Rae, that country's ambassador to the United Nations. From Italy, Nathalie Tocci, Director of the Institute for International Affairs. From France, Christiane Macarian, former Foreign Affairs Editor for the newspaper L'Express. From the USA, Christopher Hill, former ambassador to Iraq. From Germany, Daniela Schwarzer, the Executive Director of the Open Society Foundation for Europe and Eurasia. And from the G7 hosts, from here in the UK, we have the Chair of Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Welcome to you all. Our first question, it comes from Oliver in Hong Kong.
Okay, all right. So my question is, how can the G7 hope to compete with a China that refuses to play by international rules and uses its seemingly unlimited resources to push its agenda in every sphere abroad, while severely limiting foreign influence at home?
Thanks, Oliver. The question, how can the G7 hope to compete with a China that refuses to play by international rules and uses its seemingly limitless resources to push its agenda in every sphere abroad while severely limiting foreign influence at home? I mean, here we have, of course, restrictions on democratic freedoms in Hong Kong, flybys over Taiwan, with the controversial claims that China has made over the South China Sea, just to name but a few. Ambassador Hill, Christopher Hill in the US. The question, how can the G7 hope to compete with China when it refuses to play by the rules? Can it hope to? This is perhaps the great link between the President Trump administration and President Biden administration, is standing up to China.
Well, first of all, can it hope to? Of course it can. And I think one of the hallmarks of the G7 is the concept that these are a group of democracies, like-minded countries who share values. And they also, I think it's very important for them to get together and discuss this challenge to our values and this challenge to world leadership by democracies. I think President Biden has made very clear, as he's just been and just arrived in the UK, he's made very clear in the last 24 hours that he considers this summit extremely important. He wants people to know that the United States is kind of back on the stage. He realizes this is going to be a work in progress. There are a lot of things we're going to have to pick up on, and certainly one of them is dealing with China. China is not going anywhere. China is a very serious player and will be for many years, but we need to figure out policies where together we can work on shaping the environment for China to perhaps make some changes in the way they approach their environment. And let me also mention the courage of Oliver in speaking to us from Hong Kong, which has really, I think, faced the brunt of some of these changes in the way China has behaved in recent years, and some of the reasons why we need to be seized with this issue. And I can assure you, when you look at the Trump administration and the Biden administration, there are so many differences. It's almost night and day. One area, however, where it has not been different so much is in the matter of dealing with China. We need to have a forceful response, and we need to work with others, because no one single country can do that, but I think the G7 together can.
Nathalie Tocci, do you think Italy has a perhaps different perspective on China, given its desire perhaps for investment, given its own position in the world? Perhaps different from the US, different from the UK?
No, I mean, I think, under the Draghi government, there has been really quite a significant change. I mean, I think, indeed, under the previous governments, particularly in the government between the League and the Five Star Movement, when Italy signed its memorandum of understanding with China, indeed, there was a sort of questioning whether Italy's, in a sense, transatlantic credentials were as strong as they had been historically. I think with the Draghi government, there has been a very clear repositioning of Italy at the transatlantic core and a very clear distancing from China. So I think, we're back to a more traditional Italian foreign policy and place in the transatlantic community.
Daniela Schwarzer in Germany. We've heard near unanimity so far from the panellists on this question on how can the G7 hope to compete with China. Is Germany aligned firmly, do you think, with the other members of the G7?
I think today Germany has a very realistic perception of what China is. It's a rising power. It's an economic partner to Germany, but it is a systemic competitor. And that's what the government, when it takes care of the economic and political ties it has with the Chinese leadership, always emphasizes. But I do believe more can be done. There can be more emphasis on human rights and other issues. However, we also need to look at the issues where we need to partner with China. And as we said early on, climate will be a big topic, or is a big topic and will be a big topic at the G7. And I think one of the major results could be to find a strategy or find a way forward how to engage with China on fighting climate change, but without letting go of the other very important norms and values that we have to defend against China.
Senator Rui Matsukawa, you have a very different perspective than perhaps the other G7 countries. You are a lot closer to China, no?
No, I think it is Japan, I have to say. For a long time, when the European nations were very indifferent to the Chinese security concern, Japan has been very consistent about pay attention to the Chinese authoritarian behavior in especially the security fields, especially in the sea. And it is Japan actually which proposed the free and Indo-Pacific strategy. And that's now, fortunately, the US has been also employing, and we together enlarging the coalition of the Quad, India, Australia, and Japan and US. And now that we are really happy, I mean, Japan is really, really happy that the major European countries like UK or France or Germany have more interest in Indo-Pacific. And what I would like to say about China is, well, for China, Japan and China has a long history, and we are neighbors, geographically really close. We want a very stable relationship, yet Japanese territory is actually suppressed by Chinese vessels. And it is a time for the democracies to have the deterrence capability increased, united at the G7, and sending a clear message to China that it is not Chinese interest to take aggressive actions to neighborhood or in the South China Sea or East China Sea, and to observe the international liberal order so that it's good for China too, actually. But I think what we have to do now is to have the united deterrence capability and clear message to China that it can be more safe to observe liberal international order established.
So let's move on to our next question. It comes from Vitaly Pashenko, international law student from Lviv, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in Western Ukraine. Vitaly.
Very good day to all of you. Cordial greetings from the auditorium of Kyiv's Institute of International Relations. And my question is, given the fact that major international players continue to show persistent neglect of international law, is it safe to say that the United Nations Security Council and the International Court of Justice are outdated in their form and relevance? And should G7 take more active stance when it comes to the enforcement of international law?
Well, a question from Western Ukraine there, which, of course, Ukraine itself suffered a breach of international law through the illegal annexing of Crimea by Russia, which led to its expulsion from what was then the G8. It's now become the G7, and various different sanctions as well. Bob Rae is the United Nations Security Council, which I know Canada rather looks at with great respect. Is it outdated? Is the International Court of Justice outdated? Should the G7 become more muscular?
I don't think there's any contradiction in saying that the UN is a far from perfect institution, and the G7 can do more. I think the G7 can do more, and I think in fact that's what happens when the Security Council gets stuck because of the veto power of what we call the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. We have to find other ways of being more creative. And we've seen this, the emergence of what's called Magnitsky sanctions in a number of countries, which has made a difference in terms of our ability to implement sanctions and to make them more targeted and more effective. The fact that we've been able to create new accountability mechanisms in dealing with the situation in Syria and dealing with the situation in Myanmar, even though we don't have the institutional oomph and strength to actually enforce things more quickly. We faced this dilemma since 1945. The structures we created are not perfect, but I think there is a much stronger, keener sense among a number of us that we have to become more effective and indeed muscular in how we try to implement international law effectively, and how we engage in various coalitions of countries that are willing to engage together to make sure that the bullies in the world, that the authoritarian countries in the world are brought to book. And I think that's extremely important. We are facing this growing crisis of authoritarianism. It's affected your country, Vitaly, very much, and yeah, your ambassador does a great job here in talking about it in the floor of the General Assembly. But we all recognize there's much more to be done, and I think that's a clear consensus that you'll find talking to a great many countries.
Daniela Schwarzer in Germany. The question is about the usefulness or not of the United Nations Security Council and, of course, the International Court of Justice. Germany's come under a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism because of its attitude towards Russia, which Vitaly's question is pointing towards here, isn't it? And about, in particular, cooperation with Russia over the transport of natural gas. Does Germany, do you think, have a different attitude towards Russia compared to many other members of the G7?
On the more fundamental question that Vitaly has raised, on the question of rule of law, the integrity of territory, I see no difference at all. Right. The way the German government has always framed the Nord Stream 2 project, so the gas pipeline from Russia, it is a project run by companies, so it's a private sector project. That is, of course, only half the truth, because any energy project of that kind with such a partner is, of course, a hugely political project. And you can see that the government has come around to understanding this when it started putting a lot of political energy into negotiating gas transits through Ukraine to, slightly compensate what it was doing with the new gas pipeline outside of Ukraine. I personally think this was one of the big geopolitical mistakes of the Merkel government to actually go into the construction of this pipeline, because it undermines German credibility from the perspective of a number of Central and Eastern European countries, the Baltic states as well. However, and this is the story that the government tells, it is a way to keep engaged with Russia. So there are those two stories. And it is also true that from a European perspective, it is of course not helpful to cut all ties with Russia. However, the balance needs to be found. And again, on the more fundamental question that Vitaly has raised, I think it is of utmost importance that all European governments and the United States, basically all G7 members, continue emphasizing that the respect for the integrity of territory, for the rule of law, for peaceful mechanisms to solve conflicts, that this is the basis of our international cooperation.
Thanks, Daniela. Tom Tugendhat, Chair of the UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I think you've been perhaps rather clumsily described as hawkish towards Russia in your time. Do you see a role for an organisation like the G7 to sort of beef up if the United Nations Security Council is paralysed by Russia's membership?
We need to fight corruption. And what President Biden said the other day builds on work that the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United Kingdom has done since 2018, when we released our Moscow's Gold Report, and exposing corruption, preventing the spread of dirty money through our systems, and holding it until we can release it back to the people from whom it was robbed is exactly what we should be doing. Because let's not pretend that the government in Russia today under President Putin is anything other than a criminal gang. It does not represent the people. It merely exploits them. It is a brutal money-making regime for one man and his acolytes.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. Ambassador Christopher Hill, after the G7 comes NATO for President Biden, and then after NATO comes their first meeting, the first meeting of President Biden and Vladimir Putin. What will you look for in that meeting?
Well, first of all, I hope that we will not have any of these odd, frankly, inappropriate one-on-one meetings where we have no idea what was done. So I am pretty sure we will have a return to normalcy. Our president will sit down with the Russian president. They will have a meeting, proper notes will be taken, and I think there'll be an exchange of agenda items. I don't expect any huge breakthroughs, but I think Mr. Putin should go away from that meeting with a clear understanding of what the Biden administration is expecting. In terms of substance of the meeting, one of the big issues is, of course, corruption will be there, but one of the biggest issues will be this issue of cyber attacks. We've had a number of U.S. companies attacked of late in so-called ransomware attacks, where many of these companies have actually been paying this money. And we have determined that many of these attacks have come from Russia. And at best, you can say the Putin government has been indifferent. More likely, they've been complicit. So I think there will be issues of that kind to discuss. I agree with the proposition that the U.S. has to have at least a good means of communication with the Russian leadership. But I think it needs to be clear and consistent. And I think we'll look for a meeting where President Biden will kind of lay it out very clearly, so there will be no misunderstandings about where we stand.
Ambassador, thank you. Of course, at the G7, there will be nothing heard from Russia. It was a member once, it is no longer a member, and it has no platform at the gathering this weekend. Let's go on to our next question, if we could. It is from Emilio Petrescu, who is a Romanian healthcare worker living in Dublin, the Irish capital.
And my question is, why China is still considered a developing country, taking into account her military size and space development, which cost a lot of money and so forth. China is accounting for 23% of world carbon emissions by last statistics, and here in EU we are paying for consequences.
Thanks very much, Emilio. This, of course, refers to perhaps the most difficult issue hanging over this summit, and then later in the year, the so-called COP26 meeting, which is supposed to produce huge results, hopefully, on the issue of climate change. China accounts for 23% of world carbon pollution, by the last statistics, says Emilio. Here in the EU, we're paying for consequences. Why is China still considered a developing country? Daniela Schwarzer.
Well, it is indeed a big issue, and not only because of climate, but also because of the feeling, for instance, in the WTO, that we are measuring countries with different scales. The point with China is that there are deep inequalities within the country. And if you look at GDP per capita levels, China is indeed not anywhere where Europe or the United States are. However, China has highly competitive sectors of its industry. It is leading on technology in some regards. And that is why Europeans are really looking into this question, whether there's a fair treatment assured if access to China is permitted upon rules that were supposed to provide a level playing field, while China is very protective of its own market, of its own procurement, for instance, public procurement, but also really tries to protect its own status as a developing country.
Senator Rui Matsukawa, we hear so much about the need to bring China on board in any climate agreement, but from Emilio comes cynicism about the role that China has, the way that China is treated by the global community in the last set of climate negotiations.
I mean, I totally agree with Emilio. China has to be, it shouldn't be enjoying the already outdated status of the developing countries, because it's now the, you know, by 2028, maybe the Chinese GDP surpasses the US. And then in certain technologies, they are surpassing the, you know, the leading economy. And I think it was in the past, the huge gap, per capita GDP is a reason for the status for the developing countries. But I mean, WTO or like climate change or any other areas, I think China needs to be responsible for its own size and its own capability. One Belt, One Road they are promoting, they are the donors, you know, to African countries or like Asian countries. A huge amount of the money they're providing. They have this capability. You see, the government of China, unlike maybe the democracies, they should actually, in my opinion, supposed to provide their affluent budget to the people rather than buying off some countries for their own national hegemonic purposes. So I think it's time for the international community to re-evaluate China's status as a developing countries. Well, we could maybe differentiate certain frameworks, but I mean, WTO or like climate change, I think it's time for considering seriously about the changing that status. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Christian Macarian in France. Is it time to change the way that China is assessed?
There is something very important to understand about China. The Chinese themselves dislike to be considered as a rich country. They want still to be considered as part of what we called previously the third world. It's ideological and it's geopolitical. It's a mean for China, very efficient, to get connected to the rest of the world and to the poorest country, to allow China to open new roads, for instance. So it's not only the rest of the world, but it's above all China, which is the case. Why is China so eager to consider itself as a poor country, as a country colonized by Western countries? And this is a rhetoric that you hear very often when you're in China. It's the base of the ideological agenda of the Communist Party. We Chinese have been exploited. So we are the brothers of the Africans, of the rest of Asia, and so on. It's a geopolitical argument for China. And the Chinese leaders hate to be considered as a rich country. So this kind of double language is used, exploited by China as a geopolitical argument to continue to conquer, if I may say, the rest of the world.
So thank you. Right, we're going to wrap up the programme with one last quick-fire question. It's from Penwith College, which is a sixth form college very close to where the summit has been held, and it comes from a student at the college, Asha.
Can the panel identify one lesson which you've learned from the pandemic that can help us combat climate change?
That from Asha and Penwith College. If you didn't catch it, that was, could the panel identify one lesson we have learnt from the pandemic to help us combat climate change? You have 15 seconds each. I'm going to start, if I could, Christian Macarian in France. What's the lesson from the pandemic for climate change?
For the first time of history, the whole world economy was stopped during a consequent while for health and human reasons. So what has been shown is that if we are not acting together, nothing is going to be solved. So about climate, we must install more mutual systems and more multilateralism. That's the main solution, and that's the main conclusion of this crisis.
Ambassador Christopher Hill in the US.
I think we all learned that we are on spaceship Earth, that we're all together in this. I think the pandemic certainly showed that. And by the way, the American people came to an understanding of that. There's no more talk of America first or America alone. We've got to be with everyone else in dealing with these problems.
Thank you. Daniela Schwarzer in Germany.
Well, one of the lessons is clearly how dependent we are on a safe and healthy environment. And this goes into health issues, sustainability issues, but also climate. And then on a very practical level, I think we learned how much we can get done without traveling quite as much as we used to do.
And that's all we have time for from this G7 edition of World Questions. It's been fascinating to hear from all the different panelists. We can now watch and wait and see what emerges from this critical global summit. A big thank you to all of our panel who've been so generous with their time. Thanks also to our wonderful questioners, to the pupils and teachers of Penrith College, Cornwall, and to all of you watching wherever you are around the world. Goodbye.